Друзья, всем привет! Если вы впервые на моем канале, меня зовут Дарья, я ведический астролог. Это видео немного необычного, нового для моего канала формата, поскольку на этот раз я приглашаю своего учителя Марка Бони. Марк уже около 30 лет практикует ведическую астрологию и является одним из самых таких ближайших учеников К.Н. Рао. Я на самом деле обожаю Марка за его супер логичный, такой взвешенный, структурный, последовательный подход, можно сказать даже научный, к ведической астрологии. За все время своей практики он написал огромное количество книг и таких исследовательских статей на самую разную тему, часть из которых уже переведены на русский, и вот периодически они переводятся и вот появляются где-то в поле, в магазинах и так далее. В комментариях под разными видео меня не раз просили разобрать тему духовности, возможно, карты каких-то мистиков, святых, просветленных людей, либо просто людей, у которых есть какие-то склонности вот, к духовным поискам, скажем так. И я на самом деле подумала, что я даже на 1% не смогу разобрать эту тему так глубоко, подробно и интересно, как это может сделать Марк Бони. Потому что я рассматриваю Марка как одного из самых таких чистых, глубоких, светлых людей, с которыми мне вообще когда-либо доводилось пообщаться. В этом видео мы с Марком общаемся в Зуме, и он дает такую небольшую лекцию на вот как раз-таки тему духовности, какие такие показатели в гороскопе будут отвечать за духовность, и какие комбинации в карте совокупно могут давать склонность человеку искать вот этот духовный опыт, и что же вообще это значит в разрезе его жизни с точки зрения именно кармы. Видео будет на английском, но с русскими субтитрами. Уверена, что многие почерпнут для себя супер много полезной информации, так что приятного просмотра.
So yes, now we are recording. Mark, I'm very glad to welcome you here in my Kumbha astrology space. And actually, it's a huge privilege for me to have you here and to have lecture with you here. So I suggested you to discuss here spirituality topic, spirituality and horoscopes. But before we dive into this topic, I'd like you probably to start with maybe you can share with us your story, how you came to astrology, how your journey began there, because I love this story.
Well, it came through spirituality in the sense that when I was a senior in university, senior in college, I had read the book Autobiography of a Yogi, very famous book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we discovered, those of us who read the book, discovered that there was a man, Swami Kriyananda, who was a offshoot of this lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a temple of Kriya Yoga down in downtown Chicago. And so I went down there and saw him give a lecture and was very excited about studying with him. So when I graduated from college, rather than going to graduate school in medicine or law or business or anything, I went to graduate school in yoga. He had a 2-year seminary,
Mm-hmm.
2-year program, and I entered that. And a part of that program was astrology. Now, this was Western astrology.
Uh-huh.
And of course, I had a consultation with him. He didn't know me at all. And I was amazed by what he was able to say about me, about my life to date, and actually made he actually indicated that I might become an astrologer.
Mm-hmm.
Which,
According to your Western astrology chart?
according to a Western chart. Yeah, according to a Western chart, which amazed me. Because, at that time I thought astrology was like medieval superstition that only ignorant people believed in,
Mm-hmm.
but then I got very interested. I started studying Western astrology with him. I started doing charts. I started being asked to do charts. So I started doing consultations. Now we have to jump 20 years forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd been with Western astrology and a very passionate student of Western, but I wasn't doing this professionally. I was working other kinds of careers and everything. This was just like a avocation for me.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was invited by David Frawley to attend the first international symposium on Vedic astrology in the U.S., the second one actually, that K.N. Rao was the chief guest. And so then I met K.N. Rao, and I tell the story about how when he first looked at my chart, he started saying a bunch of things about my life that were completely true. Like I had a lot of sisters, 5 sisters, but I was the only male heir of my parents, that I'd studied literature, that there was a break in my education in terms of my graduate and under. He said a bunch of things, and he was just seeing the chart in his head, and he wasn't even seeing dasha. So this amazed me.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was giving a workshop the next day on predicting the birth of children, based on a book he had brought called Planets and Children. long story short, I learned these methods, and when I came back to where I live, San Diego, I made a prediction this way, and it came true. So this is my very first prediction using Vedic astrology. So this is how I got started. So I got fascinated, and I started studying it very passionately. This was starting in 1993, so it's now been like over 30 years that I've been deeply involved in Jyotish.
Mhm.
So I
Cool.
hope that answers the question.
Yes, yes, thank you. I like this story about how you met Ken Rao and how you was amazed by his prediction. So we can move on to our spirituality topic and explore it more.
So the first thing I want to say is that spirituality exists within every horoscope because spirituality exists within every individual.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, in some souls that are born, it's more awakened,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's more enlivened. We all have spirituality within it because what we are in our essence is pure spirit incarnating in a mind-body complex, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, some people are more awakened to the spiritual side and actively pursue spirituality in their lifetime, right? Some people even become what's called spiritual renunciates,
Mm-hmm.
that they renounce all kinds of worldly goals or ambitions and pursue only what would be called moksha, right? Spiritual liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are, you might say, elements of the horoscope that we evaluate when we're trying to think about how pronounced spiritual inclinations are in a birth chart.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to pull up a document now. I'm going to share screen, and I'm going to quickly go through some of those things that we evaluate, some of those things that we look at when we're evaluating spirituality in the birth chart. Okay. So you should see my document. Yes? Yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So one thing, of course, is Jupiter. Jupiter is it's called the Deva Guru.
Mm-hmm.
It's the planet among the grahas that most naturally signifies the impulse towards spirituality. It's the Jnanakaraka, the indicator of higher knowledge and wisdom, and the impulse to seek spiritual truth. Jupiter also represents the Guru. The word Guru literally means dispeller of darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a person that can potentially lead us to God realization because they have obtained that exalted state themselves, if they are a true Sadguru, right? Sadguru means they themselves have realized the ultimate truth of life. Now, so under the right conditions in a birth chart, Jupiter inclines a person towards spiritual pursuits. Not always,
Mm-hmm.
but under the right conditions, and we're going to talk more about that.
Okay.
And then, of course, among the grahas, Ketu is referred to as the moksha karaka, but it doesn't always give spiritual inclinations in any horoscope. In order for Ketu to become something that inclines a person towards spiritual pursuits, it has to get what I call spiritualized.
Mm-hmm.
And this happens in a number of different ways that I've listed here. One of the best ways that it happens is when Ketu is under the influence of Jupiter or the fifth lord or the ninth lord. Another way is when it's placed in the moksha signs, which are Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces, or in moksha houses, 4, 8, 12, or they could be placed in the dharma houses, 5 and 9. Now, if a number of these factors are happening simultaneously, then this is really going to spiritualize Ketu. And
Mm-hmm.
before I go any further, I want to show everyone an example of that. So let me know when you see a birth chart.
Yes, I see.
All right. So this is a chart of a very famous spiritual teacher from India.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very interesting story. He was originally a journalist, and he was an investigative journalist. And he went to Rishikesh to basically expose fraudulent gurus and sadhus.
Mm-hmm.
But when he went there, he met a very famous Swami Sivananda, and he completely changed his attitude, ended up becoming a disciple of this man, Swami Sivananda, became a monastic himself, became a Swami himself, and went on to become a very famous spiritual teacher. So now we want to see Ketu in his chart.
Mm-hmm.
What we would notice is, first of all, it falls in the ninth house, right? This is one of the houses that we mentioned that when Ketu falls there, it can spiritualize Ketu. but it's also in a moksha sign, Cancer, right?
Mhm.
Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. And then who's it under the influence by? You can see it gets the aspect, graha drishti, a planetary aspect of a very, very strong Jupiter.
Mhm.
Jupiter's especially strong because it's in its own sign, Pisces, and it's also Vargotama. It exists in Pisces in both the birth chart and the Vamsha. So a couple of things that I mentioned about elements of a chart that can incline a person towards spirituality are very evident in this chart. First of all, a very strong Jupiter, and not just a strong Jupiter, but strong Jupiter as the fifth lord, one of the Dharma lords. And then you have this ninth house, where the Lagna lord, Mars, goes to the ninth house, the house of the teacher, the house of the guru, but it's also with the ninth lord. And of course, these planets are conjunct Ketu. And then, of course, they're all getting the aspect of Jupiter. So when I say there are elements in a chart that incline a person towards spirituality, and I talk about Jupiter and Ketu, this would be an example of that. All right.
Mhm.
So, and then, what's really also significant this way is something called the moksha triangle. Now, we mentioned that before as being on the sign level. It's the water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. And of course, on the houses, it's the 4, 8, and 12 houses. But within the signs, there are certain 10-degree segments of the signs, in the water signs, that are known as Sarpa Drekanas, right? Sarpa means serpent.
Mhm.
And they can have a very special significance in terms of the astrology of spirituality, because under the right conditions, planets in these particular 10-degree segments of the water signs, known as Sarpadrakanas, when they become activated in the dasha sequence, they can give rise to what's called the awakening of the Kundalini Shakti, right? That then gives people experiences of higher states of consciousness. So what are these Sarpadrakanas? They are the last two drekanas. A drekana is a 10-degree segment, right? So they're the last two drekanas of Cancer. So from 10 degrees to 30 degrees of Cancer. But then also Scorpio, first 20 degrees, first and second drekanas of Scorpio, and then the last two drekanas of Pisces. So now I want to again pull up this chart that I was showing you previously. And we can see that this Jupiter, who's a fifth lord, so strong in its own sign, Pisces, also Vargotama, it's in the last 10 degrees of Pisces. So it's in this condition known as a Sarpadrashkon.
Mhm.
Now, he never really ran the Jupiter major period, but of course he would have had sub-periods, and those sub-periods could have really brought about a blossoming, you might say, of spirituality and given him some very exalted spiritual experiences as a result of awakened Kundalini. I want to pull up another chart to talk
Can I
about
ask a
this.
question about Sarpadrakana?
Sure, please.
Is it fair to say that, for example, having Jupiter or Ketu or maybe Trikona ruler in Sarpadrakana is more significant regarding to spirituality than, for example, Saturn or Venus, like spiritual planets in Sarpadrakana, Jupiter and Ketu?
Well, even natural malefics in these conditions can give rise to these types of spiritual experiences. But I have to understand that there's another side to these Sarpadrakanas. Under the right conditions, they can really give very unfavorable tendencies, even criminal and psychosexual sort of tendencies. So it just all depends on the context of the chart as a whole that they're in, and other influences that are going on with regards to a planet in the Sarpadrakana. So, but it's a good question. I want to quickly bring up this chart as we talk about, again, the astrology of spirituality. This is actually the chart of K.N. Rao's spiritual guru, Swami Pramananda Saraswati, right? And here, now, instead of K2 being in the ninth house, it's in the 12th house, the moksha house, the house most associated with moksha, spiritual liberation. It's in a moksha sign, Cancer. And if you look at its degrees, 24, 42 of Cancer, you'll remember that one of the Sarpadrakanas is for the last 20 degrees of Cancer, anywhere from 10 to 30 degrees of Cancer. So this is a Ketu that's in the Moksha Karaka is in the Moksha house, in a Moksha sign, in a Sarpadrakana. And the only influence that it gets, as you can see, is the aspect of, again, of a very strong Jupiter. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
So it's under these conditions that Ketu becomes very much a Moksha Karaka. And of course, when it's getting activated in the Dasha sequence, it can give rise to these types of very exalted spiritual experiences. Now, of course, there are different yogas that are given in the ancient text
Mm-hmm.
that can incline a person towards spiritual life. And in fact, in the main one of the main authoritative texts on Jyotish, Brihat Parasha Hora Shastra, there is a chapter specifically on what's called Pravraja yogas.
Mm-hmm.
Pravraja yogas are yogas for spiritual renunciation. K.N. Rao, my teacher, referred to them also as sannyasi yogas. A sannyasi is someone who has renounced life in the world in order to pursue spiritual goals. And one of the first combinations that is given in that ancient text for a Pravraj yoga is when you have 4 or more planets in a house, any house, but it has to include the 10th Lord, and the 10th Lord should not be combust.
Mm-hmm.
So here we see 4 planets in Gemini. It's actually the 11th house of the horoscope. It contains the 10th Lord, Venus, but if you see the degrees of the sun and you see the degrees of Venus, it's far away. There's no question of combustion.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an indication, showed the static potential along with other factors to suggest that this is someone who would renounce life in the world and pursue spiritual goals. He actually became a monastic. He became a swami, and actually also then became also quite a famous guru with many, many followers, including K.N. Rao. Now, what's interesting about his horoscope in particular is that he has another one of these Pravraj sannyasi yogas that's defined only in the Navamsha, or primarily in the Navamsha. And this is when the moon is in the sign of Mars, aspected by Saturn, or Saturn is in the sign of, or the moon is in the sign of Saturn, aspected by Mars. So let me say that again. The moon in Navamsha, we're looking at Navamsha here, has to be in the sign of Mars, aspected by Saturn, or the moon has to be in the sign of Saturn, aspected by Mars. Here, moon is in Aries, the sign of Saturn, and sign of Mars, and then it's aspected by Saturn. So he has 2 yogas given in the ancient text for spiritual renunciation, and he did in fact become a spiritual renunciate. So we're looking at Jupiter, we're looking at Ketu, we're looking at planets in Sarpadrakanas, we're looking at the Dharma houses,
Mm-hmm.
5 and 9. In fact, I will say right now that K.N. Rao, I heard him say once, and I've seen it to be true, that some of the greatest spiritual progress that a person can make is when they are running periods of the 5th Lord or the 9th Lord. And one of the most, and because one of the, you might say hidden, not hidden, but esoteric meanings of the 5th house is Purva Punya.
Mm-hmm.
Purva Punya, what does Purva Punya mean? It means merit from the previous lifetime, spiritual merit from the previous lifetime. So, in the Bhagavad Gita, this dialogue between Lord Krishna and Arjuna, at one point, Arjuna says, well, this idea of obtaining God realization, it sounds pretty good, but I'm about to fight a battle.
Mm-hmm.
I might get killed. What happens then? And first of all, Krishna says, well, no effort this way is ever lost. What will happen is that you'll reincarnate into circumstances that are very conducive or very foster the idea of you at some point picking up this pathway again, right? And then he also says, well, and even the most favorable birth is when you're born in the household of yogis. That is, you're born to parents and you have a genetic background of individuals who themselves are very spiritually developed, right? So this is what the 5th house, 5th Lord represents our Purva Punya. And one of my favorite examples of this is the chart of the very famous Indian realized saint, Ramana Maharishi. So I'm going to pull up my program again, and we're going to pull up the chart of Ramana Maharishi. This is an example of how a Purva Punya can manifest. You're seeing the chart now?
Yes.
Okay. So now his fifth lord, Saturn, is very interesting to consider based on the things we've been talking about. So first of all, it's in the moksha sign Pisces, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, it's in Asarpa Drakane.
Right.
And thirdly, it's so strongly under the influence of Jupiter. How? You see that they exchange signs, both in the birth chart. So Jupiter, Saturn's in Pisces, Jupiter's sign Pisces, Jupiter's in Saturn's sign Aquarius, also very strong because it's Vargotama. And then if you look in the Navamsha, you can see that they exchange again.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So at age 5, you can see that he moved into his Saturn major period. Well, he got a big shock in life when his father unexpectedly died at a very when he was quite young. And this really sort of shook him up. And he started reading spiritual texts, studying spiritual texts. And to make a long story short, he had a spontaneous, full God realization at the age of 16 in his Saturn Sun period. So how could something like this happen? So he was obviously a soul who in previous lifetimes had been striving very passionately for liberation, for spiritual moksha, but he had died just before, you might say, he had completed the journey. But then he was born into circumstances that were very conducive to him picking up, you might say, where he left off. And as a result of his Purva Punya, the spiritual merit of the previous lifetime, at a very young age, he had a spontaneous full God realization. So it's an example of how a fifth house, fifth lord planet can get you back on a spiritual pathway that you'd been on previously in a previous lifetime as a result of Purva Punya, previous life merit. So now I'm going to bring up that document again. Well, actually, I want to go back to his chart again because we've been discussing spirituality from the standpoint of how it can be seen from the Parashari system point of view, right? But as you know, we have another system of Jyotish that is attributed to sage Maharishi Jaimini. The main work related there is what's called the Jaimini Sutras. And I once heard K.N. Rao say that in order to go deeply into the horoscope in terms of spiritual potentials, you should know the Jaimini system. And the reason this was spoken about is because in the Jaimini system, we have something called the Atmakaraka, right? Atma means the soul or the self, right? And Karaka means indicator of. So in the Jaimini system, we have one planet that is referred to as the Atmakaraka, and the indicator of soul, you might say. And this is the planet that has the highest degrees among all the grahas, excluding Rahu and Ketu. We don't count Rahu and Ketu in this sense. 7 Karakas. So what planet here, of course, has the highest degrees among all the planets, regardless of any kind of sign? And of course, it comes out to be the moon. It's listed here as the AK, which stands for Amakaraka. You can see that it's a completely full moon, right? Well, actually, just past complete fullness. So extremely bright moon. Where does it fall? Falls in the 9th house of Dharma. What additional strength does it have? It's Vargotama. And then who is it closely conjunct? It's closely conjunct Ketu. So this is the indication from the Jaimini standpoint of someone who was born and destined, to have very profound spirituality and very profound spiritually awakening. So this is how this could be seen, because it says in the Jaimini Sutra that based on a person's Atmakaraka, both in the birth chart and in the Navamsha, one can get a sense to what degree a person is in bondage by the karma or has some degree of liberation or could obtain some degree of liberation or make a lot of progress towards that. We evaluate the Amakarka and the horoscope. And of course, when we think about who's its dispositor, what sign is the moon in, and what planet is that? And of course, it comes out to be Mercury here. But then even if you see the Lagna Lord Venus, you'll notice that it's in the very, very earliest degrees of Scorpio, which of course is a Sarpa Drekana. So many of the elements that we've spoken about here with regards to the astrology of spirituality, obviously very evident in his chart, not surprisingly, based on who this individual was and their spiritual attainment, right? So
Okay.
yeah, go
Excuse me,
ahead.
just to be clear about Atmakarka, as I understood, that we consider that the one has some potential in spirituality according to Gemini if Atmakarka has sources of strength and well placed in the chart. And additionally, if it in conjunction with Ketu, right?
Well, there are many things that, when we think about the Amakarka, it's going to be in some sign, it's going to be in some house, it's going to be associated with some planets. All of these are a part of the picture, you might say. Right? But what the Shastra says, specifically is if the Amakaraka would be in moksha houses or signs, or dharma houses and signs, say, and with the influence of moksha karaka Ketu, and say additional benefic influence, particularly Jupiter, these of course are going to be indications that way. Right?
Okay,
But
get it.
again, I like to teach through examples. So let me pull up my let me share screen again and pull up my program, and then I'm going to show you the chart of considered one of the greatest female saints, who was even viewed as being something like an incarnation of Divine Mother. And this is a woman that was referred to as Anandamaya Ma. This is the chart that I'm bringing up here. And when we see this chart, focus in on the Atmakaraka, because that's what we're discussing. Here it is. So who's the Atmakaraka here?
Venus.
What's its condition?
Yes, it's exalted. It's Vargotama. It's in
It's both exalted and Vargotama. Who's its dispositor?
It's Jupiter. It's exalted. Its dispositor is exalted Jupiter, expecting Venus.
Now let me add one more piece to the puzzle. When we're evaluating spirituality in the birth chart from the Jaimini point of view, we're not just looking and evaluating the Atmakaraka, but also the Jaimini equivalent of the fifth house, fifth lord of Purva Punya. That would, of course, be the planet with the fifth highest degrees. That's called the Putra Karaka, which literally means Karaka of children, but it carries all the significations of the fifth house, including Purva Punya. And we can see here that this Jupiter here is exalted as the PK. So she has this exalted PK, and then she has this exalted AMK and exalted PK. And these are just one of many factors in her chart that show that she was born with a profoundly developed spirituality. Well, in the Yoga Sutras, it says, how can one experience samadhi? How can one experience higher states of consciousness? How can one experience God, you might say? And it says that through different yoga practices like meditation, dhyan, these states can be obtained, but it also says that states can be obtained simply because it's one's karma to have this experience. And I'm going to be pulling up the chart of someone that K.N. Rao referred to as his Jyotish Guru, but he referred to him as Yogi Bhaskarnandaji, because he was someone who was also a very developed, very advanced yogi. So now, who is his first of all, where's Ketu?
Fifth house, Purva Punya, you mean?
Ketu's in the fifth house. Who's it get aspected by?
Jupiter.
A very strong ninth lord Jupiter, right? And then must remember that in the classical 8 limbs of yoga, and maybe I should show this first. So, before I do this, let me show this first. It was very interesting for me. Did you see the document now?
Yes.
It was very interesting to me because I'd been a student of yoga while I was simultaneously first learning astrology, Western astrology. And at a very young age, I was instructed in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, where it gives the classical 8 limbs of yoga, the ultimate limb being the samadhi, right? Which is, spiritual ecstasy. And I was fascinated to learn from K.N. Rao that the classical 8 limbs of yoga correlate with the first 8 houses of the horoscope, with the 8th house actually representing this most exalted experience of samadhi. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to go back to this horoscope of K.N. Rao's Jyotish Guru, this man, Yogi Bhaskaranandaji. So we saw that Ketu in his chart gets spiritualized. Why? It's in the Dharma house, 5th house, but mostly also because it gets the aspect of a strong Jupiter, not just a strong Jupiter, but Jupiter as the 9th lord. Now, who's the 5th lord?
Sun is in
Sun is the 5th lord. Where does it go? Into the 8th house of Samadhi. Does it have any source of strength?
Sure, Vargotama.
It's Vargotama. Now see its degrees. First 20 degrees of Scorpio, Sarpadrakana. Do you see? So these are these are factors that we look at with regards to awakened spirituality in the birth chart, or just someone who is striving to develop spiritually.
Yes, for sure. And interesting that it not repeats, but it looks interesting from the moon, because Ketu in a 9th house from the moon.
Right, exactly. And where does the 9th lord go from there? And then in the 12th house of Moksha, Vargotama. You can see these things from different perspectives as well. But I want to show that these things don't just appear in the charts of very exalted saints. That people have these experiences as well. One time when I was teaching in Russia, I think it was back in 2014, I was basically giving the presentation that I'm giving to you. And afterwards, someone, a Russian woman, came up and talked about how she had a Kundalini awakening experience. And she was kind enough then to share her birth chart and when this happened. We have to see, are there any planets here in Sarpadrakanas? And if we focus in on the planets in Cancer, then we'll see that that is the case. Remember that the Sarpadrakana happens from 10 degrees of Cancer to 30 degrees. So she actually has 2 planets, Mars, and then also Venus in a Sarpadrakana, right? And Venus is not just any old planet for this Lagna, it's also the 9th lord, right? And so when she ran, let me see here, this would have been, when she ran Mars-Venus, this is when she'd had this experience, if I recall correctly. It was exactly in Mars-Venus, the period and sub-period of 2 planets that are involved in a Sarpadrakana. Now, if you see these from the moon, you'll see now that Mars is the 1st lord and the 8th lord. And then also we see the perspective of Dasha Lagna, in which case Mars now becomes the 5th lord.
Yes, right.
So you see also how Mars's debility here gets very effectively canceled.
Yes, by exchange.
By exchange with the moon. So I wanted to show, and if you don't mind my using my own chart as an example, this is why when I found out that Samadhi was related to the 8th house, it had this was particularly interesting to me, and I'll show you why. I mentioned that, after I graduated from university, the first thing that I did is got involved in this yoga seminary. and basically was living the life of a spiritual renunciate at that time. I was being initiated into the techniques of Kriya Yoga, the spiritual practices of Kriya Yoga, and was devoting a good portion of my time every day to these practices. And this was in my Mars major period, which, as you can see, is the eighth lord in the eighth house. And it was actually in my Mars moon period. Of course, the moon here is in the 12th house. It's with Ketu. In my Mars moon period, I had a very powerful spiritual experience, Kundalini awakening, had a taste of samadhi, spiritual ecstasy. And this was something that happened during that time. And, I said that at that time I was living the life somewhat of a spiritual renunciate. If you go to my Navamsha, I spoke about that particular sannyasa yoga, Ravraj yoga, that happens when the moon is in the sign of Mars aspected by Saturn. And of course, you can see that that is the case for me here. The moon is in Scorpio, sign of Mars aspected by Saturn. So, it was characteristic of my life during this time that I was very involved in doing very intense sadhana, living more the life of a spiritual renunciate. And this gave rise to this experience. And it was just very fascinating to learn that because, of course, the eighth house has a very bad reputation. But the other extreme of that is that some of the most exalted spiritual experience that a person could have is a result of this indication of the eighth house as relates to samadhi. So now I want to talk about some other yogas that can incline a person towards spirituality that is given in the ancient text. And again, I'm not going to be using the chart of these well-known spiritual figures, but someone that was actually a Russian student well known to me. And I'm going to pull up this chart here. So in the Sanskrit text Paladipika, one of the main Parashari texts, there are three yogas given. Each of it pertain to the different elements of what's called the Hindu Trinity. So in the spiritual tradition of India, when they conceive of God, they conceive of God in terms of having three primary aspects: a creative aspect that's referred to as Brahma, a sustaining aspect referred to as Vishnu, and a dissolving aspect referred to as Shiva. So each of these yogas given in this text Paladipika are referenced to and are pertaining to some aspect of the divine. Now, one of those is called Shrikanta Yoga. Kanta Yoga is a reference to Shiva because Shiva was Nilakanta. He drank the poison in the myth and got the blue neck. So Shrikanta Yoga is a yoga defined by when the sun, the moon, and the Lagna Lord must all be angles and trines. And of course, all yogas are more powerful if the planets involved have sources of strength. So now you see here that the sun is in the ninth house, a trine house. The moon is in the Lagna, both in a trine and an angle. And the Lagna Lord also is in an angle. It goes to the seventh house. Now, these planets aren't really that remarkable in terms of their sources of strength, but the moon here is interesting to consider. It's a waxing moon, and it's more than half full, and it is in its debilitation sign, but it's Nichabanga, right? It gets the aspect of its own sign lord, Mars. It gets the aspect of its exaltation lord, Venus, and of course it's also Vargotama. So she has Shrikanta Yoga. Now, another of these yogas is called Srinatha Yoga. Natha is referred to as a reference to Lakshmi. Lakshmi is the consort of Vishnu. So this is the Vishnu variety of this particular type of yoga. It's defined when Mercury, Venus, and the ninth lord all are in angles and trines. And this is what we have here again, because Venus, of course, is strong as the seventh lord in the seventh house, and Mercury is in an angle, the 10th, and the ninth lord is this moon that goes to the Lagna. So she not only has Shrikanta Yoga, but she has Srinatha Yoga. And of course, Srinatha Yoga would have been enlivened, would have got activated in her chart when she ran the Venus Mahadasha. And in the Venus Mahadasha, a spiritual guru came into her life. She got onto the spiritual pathway related to the Sanatana Dharma, the spiritual pathways that comes from ancient India. And she got one of the things it says about Srinatha Yoga is that it's like a person could be constantly chanting the name of the Lord. This woman got seriously into Vedic chanting. And sometimes, every day she would be part of a group that would chant something called Sri Rudram, which is a very powerful practice in the spiritual tradition of India. And she would be chanting Vishnu Sahasranam. This would be happening every day on a weekend, sometimes up to 4 to 6 hours a day. And she became very, very proficient at this. But then, of course, she moved out of the Venus period. What runs next? The Sun major period, which, of course, is a part of this Shrikantha. So she was traveling to India, visiting sacred sites. You can see it in the ninth house. She was going to the ashram of her guru. Of course, it's in the ninth house of the guru. So again, it's in this period that her spirituality and interest in spirituality and spiritual activities continues strongly. But then what will she run next? She will run the moon. So do you see how she gets consecutive dashas that are activating these yogas that incline a person towards spiritual life? Now you can see her Ketu. Where is it? It's in the moksha sign Pisces, and it's in the Dharma fifth house. And it was actually in the Jaimini system when she was running her Pisces major period that this was all happening from the standpoint of you can see that she was entered the Pisces period at age 38 in 2015, right? This is kind of the indications from the Jaimini point of view, why she was so much involved in the chanting of mantra being, of course, one of the indications of the fifth house. And we can see her at Makaraka, right? Now it has a lot of different influences, but the good thing about it, of course, it's in its own sign. It's not like the Atmakarakas of these great realized Indian saints that we looked at, but still it's has some good features about it. So now the third yoga that relates to one of the aspects of the divine, relates to Brahma, the creator, is what's called Virinchi Yoga. And I'm pulling up an example of this, pulling up the chart of a longtime friend and colleague who's also someone who is a very good Vedic astrologer. You might even recognize the name, Von Paul Manley. He wrote a really excellent book on birth time rectification. Now, this yoga is defined by when Saturn, Jupiter, and the fifth lord all must be in angles and trine. And again, the more the planets have source of strength, then the stronger the yoga, and you'll see the effect of that yoga in the person's life. And it says of this yoga that one will be a Brahma Gyan, meaning that you'll have knowledge, higher knowledge of spirituality. You'll revere sacred scriptures. It's also a yoga for having distinguished students if you're a teacher, which he is, by the way. So you see here, Jupiter and Saturn are actually there together in the first house. Saturn being exceptionally strong here as the Lagna Lord, because it's both in its own sign as the Lagna Lord in the Lagna, but also Vargotama. Jupiter here is in its debilitation sign, but very Nichabanga, strong cancellation of the debility, because it's with its sign lord. And then you can see it goes to Aquarius in Navamsha, which Jupiter always gives very strong results in Aquarius. Yes, and then who's the fifth lord? It's this Venus that goes to the fourth house, having two sources of strength. First of all, it's Vargotama. Secondly, it gets directional strength in the fourth house. So all the components of this the Virinchi Yoga is quite strong in his chart. And of course, when is that going to come out? It's going to come out when he runs the associated periods. So back in 1994 is when he moved into his Jupiter major period. And of course, he's a very, very strong member of the Sanatana Dharma and engages in spiritual practice, had spiritual gurus himself, very much on the spiritual pathway, very much inclined spiritually, does Vedic chanting. And this has all been really prominent through the 16 years of Jupiter, followed by the 19 years of Saturn, which will go up to 2029. So he gets two consecutive dashas. 16 and 19, that's 35 consecutive years of the activation of the yoga in his horoscope. Now, I'm also blessed to have this combination in my own birth chart, and it really sort of reflects how at a very early age I got on the spiritual pathway. Now, because you can see here in my chart also, Saturn and Jupiter are both in angles. Both have a source of strength. Jupiter's in its own sign. Saturn goes to Aquarius, its own sign in Navamsha. And Saturn is also the fifth lord. So Saturn here helps qualify and fulfill the requirements for the yoga in two ways. And if you look at my Rahu, of course, Rahu will always give the results of the planet who's the sign that it's in. And if you see its degrees, it's also in Jupiter's nakshatra. So actually, this yoga got activated when I was in my mid-20s. And so, but then what follows Rahu? 16 years of Jupiter, followed by 19 years of Saturn. So in my case, this yoga continues to be activated throughout 18 years of Rahu, 16 years of Jupiter, and now the 19 years of Saturn, which I'm coming towards the end of now. And so this is an example of how, if you don't see this yoga in the birth chart, you would really not understand, you might say, one of the main themes of my entire life. And so this is why it's so critical to be able to know yogas in astrology, in Jyotish, to be able to see some certain static potentials that would be completely missed if you didn't understand that Jupiter and Saturn are involved in this Varinsha yoga, and that Rahu would also give its results. Daria, I'm not sure how long you wanted to go here, but how are we doing?
I think we're doing fine, and we covered so many information here. I think it's so valuable for everyone who will see this lecture. Actually, thank you so much. I really appreciate that you're here on my channel. I hope that it's not the last time that we're
Well,
here.
it was absolutely my pleasure. You can see how much I love talking about this topic, so Daria, thanks for inviting me. And of course, if you would like to do something again in the future, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you so much. So
All
have
right.
a nice day.
Yeah. Bye for now. Take
Bye.
care.